all your faces. Some of you I've known before and some of you are new, so it's always welcome to meet some new folks here. I've had the pleasure of joining this community on a number of occasions over the last couple of years, and I really always look forward to it. As Robin just noted, I'm often kind of the sole representative of design, and I speak design broadly in architecture specifically, but the design arts in missions. And this is really kind of opposed to the finer or performing arts that often some of you are involved in. So I often kind of view my presentation as a unique opportunity to share with an audience outside of my design circles. And so in that, I just kind of see my role as a bit of a reporter of neighboring conversation that's happening. So with that, I hope and expect that there's some kind of cross alignment with conversations on the fine and performing arts side of missions, right? And if that doesn't actually happen, perhaps design has something to learn, which is why I love coming and hearing what you guys are speaking about. Or perhaps design can introduce the conversation to you guys of our allies, what's happening over on our side. Or really, if all that fails, I hope this talk can just really simply be kind of an interesting curiosity to you. But it's from that frame, really, that I want to bring to you a telling of what I would consider a very prominent emerging conversation within evangelical missiological space design, which in my estimation is actually the beginning to initiate a future phase of consideration, really at this breaking point from our last 50 years of approach. So that's my hope today. So roughly since 1970s, 80s in America, space design, particularly church space design, was intentionally considered a missional strategy. I'll call this model the secular attractional model that you see up there. While I'm beginning to identify this new phase in missional space design as what I'm calling the sacred longing model. To begin, let me briefly seek to summarize the missiological approach to space design that occupied our minds and churches of designers roughly since 1970. Now, I'm not going to really belabor this because I trust that each of us are somewhat familiar with this territory, noting that we've all kind of lived through this in this last 50-year cycle. But I think it's again worth noting that the relationship of space design, historically speaking, has fundamentally really just been about utility. While there's been notable exceptions, if you kind of take the mile-high view over the span of historical records and discussion, you really have two conversations, one being on utility, as I said, how do we get sight lines and acoustics, and how do we kind of get the spoken word out? And if there happens to be some who have theological reflections on space design, again, at the mile-high view, this is roughly speaking, beginning to argue that space is not sacred after the advent of Christ's resurrection. So that's kind of the bed that Protestant church design and space design has grown up in. But there are these missional strands that become prominent within space design, within this kind of historical tale. Now, traditionally speaking, historical mission efforts have often gone from the church outwards to try and reach unreached populations. And in this case, the architecture has really just been appropriated, supporting utility function, kind of aiding this outward movement. Now, there's innumerable examples of this, and all of you can think of this. Let me just kind of share a few classic images, which is kind of fun to look at. Right, we can all begin to think of the great classic examples in America, how architecture was appropriated for traditional missional purposes. On the screen, we see images here of camp meetings. Right, we begin to use acoustic structures, lifting preachers up, adding soundboards to allow the acoustics to come out into the audience. All right, but again, all these temporary structures. We also use bigger temporary structures, such as tents, and these kind of constructed tabernacles, really intending to provide shelter to a large number of individuals as missions will go out to reach these populations. Here's the image of Billy Sunday's tabernacle, the kind of construction of it, and some of the interiors. Now, granted, there are some moments within mission architecture that began to develop a slightly larger role than pure utility. Kind of one fun historical example we'll just share here. As the first Presbyterian church in New York in 1832, with the conversion of the Chatham Theater. Right, so this time in New York, churches were going out and holding services in secular buildings such as schools and empty warehouses. So it's kind of fun when I talk to churches and we're doing something new. We're going to go rent a church and go to the population. When the evangelicals have been doing this since mid 1800s, and they would go and find these borrowed buildings, temporary kind of occupation, allowing them to relocate to unchurched populations. Now, again, this is kind of utility use of enabling going out and reaching unchurched populations. Now, this is kind of the case for the first Presbyterian. However, Louis Tappan, the founder or the kind of funder of this, really had a different idea. He sought to repurpose the Chatham Theater into a church, and he called Charles Finney to come and speak with this. And granted, it was a perfect place for Finney and his dramatics to preach. It was very attractive in that way. But Tappan began to think of this as a little bit different than pure utility. he really thought that if we could renovate this and change this into a church, it'd be of this really great spectacle and curiosity that would draw in a lot of crowds. And so, as Louis Tappan noted here, it would strike a great blow to one of Satan's haunts. It would have the effect of storming and taking and canning and turn upon the enemy. We shall break the place admirably located for the destruction of souls, carrying on to the end. Taking a theater and appropriating it for a church would cause great sensation and curiosity. We'll be excited in the city and out of it to visit a place such appropriated, right? So this kind of idea of attractional. Now, I'm going to go ahead and fast forward between 1870 and 1970. There's a lot that happens within there, but for the sake of time, I'm just setting the background here. So we're fast forwarding here to the 1970s and into the heart of what I would call the secular attractional model of space design. So in the cases prior to this, as we looked at, architecture was a servant role to the efforts of going out to reach unreached populations. But with the advent of church growth movement in the mid-1900s and its subsequent application to the American setting in the 1970s, the relationship between architecture and missions really changed in America. So in the church growth, right, and as it evolved, other names came about with it, seeker sensitivity, attractional models. The building moved from this kind of supportive utility function and really took on a lead role in this kind of missiological drama. So with an emphasis change from going out to unreached populations, right, there was a refocus on trying to draw unchurched populations into the church. And when that happened, the architecture became a key factor for this attractional strategy. Now, granted, it should be noted that even though the building was an attractional tool, the conversation was still anchored in this foundational soil of the Protestant anti-sacred kind of narrative. Right? The building was not sacred, but yet it still needed to attract people by reducing barriers and being seeker sensitive. Right? So on the screen, you can see a quote from Bill Hybels here, mid-1980s. Are you up to date? Are you contemporary? Are you locked in antiquity? Are you trying to force an atmosphere contrived upon us? Right? We want him, referring to unchurched Harry and Mary, to do. I was just at a corporate headquarters in IBM in Atlanta on Wednesday. Now I come to church, and it's basically the same. Neutrality, comfort, contemporary, clean. This is what we want to communicate. Right? So we've all lived through this. And so we did this, right? And for the last 40 to 50 years, we've attempted to make the most attractive, secular-focused, secular-rooted, multi-purpose structures, not only because it fits our utilitarian needs, but also because it was a missional strategy to attract people to a comfortable secular manifestation of the church. Right? So we're holding church in indoor soccer fields and such. Okay. So what I've told you up to this point, I trust you'll really find familiar. All right, if you take a drive across nearly any part of America, you'll easily spot this Evangelicals' multi-billion-dollar investment in this missiological strategy. Okay. But now I want to introduce you to a widespread conversation that's happening. This is my kind of offering to the EMS this year, even though it's a bit in its infancy in the design world, but you're really kind of at the leading edge here. So in this new conversation, it really branches from grappling with Charles Taylor's epic work, A Secular Age. Right, this conversation has really been working its way through broader evangelical circles for the last decade, if you read the periodicals and some of the commentary and books coming out. But designers and missiologists are just beginning to find a synergy with Taylor's work. Kind of the outworking of the synergy is what I'm calling the sacred longing model. And it's arguably this new phase within architecture's place within missional strategy. So if you're unfamiliar with Taylor's work, let me give you a few words just to introduce you to the argument here. So Charles Taylor, right, a philosopher up in Canada, in his epic work, and it was summarized by James K. Smith in a great little book called How Not to Be Secular. Taylor originally attempts to chart the contemporary religious landscape like a cartographer. He seeks to answer the question, how was it that 1,000 years ago, it was almost impossible not to believe in God, when now it's almost impossible to believe in God? What happened? What happened there? So he reviews the current telling of this narrative, and Taylor quickly notes that the story is not as clean as it's currently being told. The current telling of this, and rebutted by Taylor in this book, is that secularism is a result of subtraction, or removal of religion from culture. So for example, this narrative can and often is told as a story of reason and science entering into culture, replacing religion, which has and is subsequently subtracting religion from culture. Right? This idea of secular, right, is simply an absence of religion, right? And as Taylor kind of argues, it's not fully accurate reading of the current situation. So rather, instead of mere subtraction, the key to understanding the situation is to look at the change in plausibility structures. So when we do this, we begin to see that the landscape in reality is not just a subtraction and the adding of reason, it's really this cross-pressured space, right? And this cross-pressuring is really disorienting in the secular age. You know, it's not belief versus unbelief, religion versus secularism, belief versus reason. You know, it's not simply an age where people stop believing as if religion was removed from society. It's not that tidy. Right? One of the main arguments he makes is that we have moved fundamentally from an enchanted or transcendent framework to a disenchanted or eminent framework. And with this change, the plausibility structures have really muddled. All right, and this has happened in a few key ways. Again, I won't belabor this, but I'll put up a chart here just to let me highlight a few of them. It might be a little small there, but let me kind of tell a few of these. So in this, right, in the transcendent frame, it was a transcendent world, right? There was an enchanted world. Real spiritual forces acted in the world, and humans were just one of several actors in the world. As we move to the eminent frame, we're now disenchanted. There's no spiritual beings acting on the world, and humans are the primary actors. Now, Taylor goes through a great telling of how this happened, but these are some of the key differences here. In the transcendent frame, we're very porous. The self is open to outside forces, and humans are only part of this complex order, and to be human is to be kind of part of this. But the buffered self, as Taylor says, as self becomes bounded and it's an inward space. It's not vulnerable to spiritual forces, and humans give autonomous order to life. We have to invite the spiritual into our lives. Please, God, come, I'm inviting you in, as opposed to almost a level of fear of, well, I'm just one of these things in the spiritual world, and they can attack me or bless me at any time, right? So then in that case, meaning came from outside the self in the transcendent frame, where meaning is really from inside the self in the eminent frame. And with that, community thus is primary in a transcendent frame, because you have to band together in order to help protect against the spiritual forces, as opposed to an eminent frame where self becomes primary. Again, we won't belabor this, but in the transcendent frame, the world is cosmos versus the world is universe. And in transcendent frame, it's a construal time. Mundane time is transcended by higher time, where now in our eminent frame, it's just chronological time. It works within the natural universe. It's measured and it's controlled. All right. So noting this kind of change in plausibility structure, Taylor builds this argument, which serves as kind of the bedrock for what we're calling the sacred longing model of architectural design. So Taylor notes, because we're living in a cross-pressured space, we don't simply believe or not believe, as we talked about. Rather, normal people are now simultaneously pressured by belief and unbelief. So he has this great lens, and those who are disconnected from religious faith are haunted by the transcendent, fearing that something may have been left. But yet those who seek the Christian faith don't just believe, but they often believe, they don't believe instead of doubting, I'll put it this way, but they often believe while doubting, is kind of the contemporary reality. So knowing this, Christian architectural designers, and there's big, if you're unfamiliar, there's this big cottage industry or kind of sub-industry of church builders who have really sought to promote and build based off of these missional models, right? There's a big industry surrounding the attractional model, but it's interesting that the leaders here are beginning to think through this a little bit with churches they're working with. And so churches, these architects who are working with these mission-minded congregations, they're beginning to ask a new set of questions. Right. In the attractional model, the secular attractional model, they would begin asking things like, what would make a unchurched person feel welcome? What would make them feel comfortable? How would we remove barriers? Right. We're not asking, or the leading folks aren't really asking these questions anymore. Rather, they're asking a new set of questions that are exploring the possibility of, can we tap into this sacred longing for folks as a key missional attraction? Right. We're still within this attractional model, but changing its focus. And can we do that with an architectural design? Right. So some of the new questions are being asked are up here on the screen. Right. Is reinforcing the eminent frame actually winning cross-pressured populations? So is it smart to be building secular-based church architecture? Isn't that just beginning to reinforce the eminent frame? Right. Are individuals actually really attracted to the secular, or are they with this longing? Are they attracted to the sacred? Right. How are structures supporting or altering plausibility structures is becoming a big conversation. Does entering a transcendent plausibility structure, can that be used in a missional way? If people are haunted by the secular, can that curiosity draw people to the sacred? And can the church uniquely fill this felt need for some sense of the sacred, right? And then what role can architecture play in this? And just as in the secular attractional model, the church building plays a big role in this as a kind of visible manifestation of the church. So what's really interesting to me here is that we have to note this is very much a missiological focused idea, right? There's been a lot of discussion, and I have bookshelves full of people talking about sacred architecture from a theological point of view. How can the sacred, what is the sacred? How does it connect with God? How does it express our theology? How do we do spiritual formation? Right? That's not this conversation. This conversation is looking at the sacred now and the sacred longing in a missiological, attractional, unchurched way. It's really fascinating when you join these conversations. The sacred conversation is for the unchurched, and really the secular they're still kind of applying to the church for community building. So for the church people, we just need to have gyms and we need to have kitchens and we need to have soccer fields. But for the unchurched, maybe we build something sacred for them. So it's this fascinating kind of turn. Again, but that point noting, we're not doing it out of theology, we're doing it out of missiology. Right? So the architecture is beginning to try and seek to find sacred expressions so that it can attract unchurched. Right? Again, it's not for the purposes of the church. So consequently, this is really kind of the first generation of architectural explorations that are being thought of as sacred billboards, sometimes is how it's being referred to, or sidebars, often understood as like attachments to the larger secular architecture. Wanting to be mindful of time here, let me just kind of share a few quick examples of what have literally been described to me by the architects as billboards or kind of attachments and how these things have been working. So you may be familiar with some of these, but it's been interesting talking with the architects behind some of this. So Mariners Church here in Irvine, it's a standard mega church. As you see there, this kind of very secular approach. They just did a recent renovation of some sort. You can actually see some of the Christian symbolism coming back, which is kind of interesting on this. But more interesting during the design discussion, right, as I talked with the architects and work with them here locally, it really became a conversation of how do you create a billboard for the church that will attract the unchurched? How do you create what they call a sign building to attract people? And yeah, we could certainly use it for sacred moments and ceremonies and things like that, but the real motivation is kind of a billboard. And so what do they put up? Right. This is it. This is the billboard. It's fantastically beautiful, right? It's very kind of traditional. This would be kind of German low Gothic kind of ideas with these lakes on the inside. This is what it looks like. So it's this chapel sitting outside of the building, much closer to the street. In a rough way, like if you had a Walmart and a restaurant out on the kind of outlot, this billboard would be out there. And this is the sense of the inside. Again, this was put up as an attractional element close to the road in front of the larger church. Now, Mariners was a really leading part of this, partly because the firm they're working with, the architect, is very much 5, 6, 7, 8 years ahead of this conversation. But interestingly, since this time, there's been ever increasing amount of these. So in the last year, I've just been getting tons and tons of calls from churches and architects and popular Christian evangelical publications wanting to discuss the viability of sacred, or in a very practical way, kind of sacred chapel attachments to their big boxes, again, as this attractional element, getting interesting interviews from Christian publications on, have we ever thought about churches as holding some sacred function? What would that even look like? I joke a little bit as an architect, because the answer is yes. Architects have thought about the sacred in the church for a very long time. We haven't thought about it for a little while here, but it is there. Things to draw on. So a few more, again, with the desire to provide a juxtaposed sacred call to individuals, providing a way to release, in this case, the architect told me, release pent up sacred energy, right? This is a chapel design here. So this is the main church, and then you can see the main church in the background. This was erected as part of that. And this is kind of a side, again, very kind of traditional sacred kind of forms to kind of release this pent up sacred energy. And there would be the inside. Again, all these are taking very Protestant-y kind of approaches to this. This isn't high Gothic. This isn't kind of Catholic ideas, but it's still aiming for the sacred. Let's grab one down closer to you guys there in Dallas who are there. All right, Watermark Community Church. Now this took a little bit of a different mode. This is the exterior, and then this is the lobby. A beautiful place if you guys haven't been there. It's got a large auditorium like most evangelical churches do. But in talking with the architects, they too were looking at how is it that we can build a way to release some of this pent up sacred energy and support our congregation. Now this was actually tucked back further in the building, but it's tucked in a way so slightly less visible than the kind of first model, which was kind of a billboard model. But talking with the architects, this was really a desire to attract individuals and provide them a space to live out these sacred hauntings and sacred longings, right, either formally or informally. So that was kind of the intent behind it, although it's tucked back in their building a little more. All right, so this became a critical part of their design strategy, right, and their missional strategy for it. And you can see the space there. So there's many more examples on the drawing boards right now. As I said, I'm kind of bringing this to you as a leading edge. I think in the next 3 to 5 years, granted COVID has kind of paused some of this, but 3 to 5 years, you're going to start seeing these sacred attachments showing up at a church near you. And it's going to be happening across the nation from my read. But what I want to trust you'll begin to see that these are an interesting new conversation here. And again, as we're here today to kind of track the conversation of future evangelical missional strategy. So I bring this offering to you from the design side that there's been a really fundamental shift it's hard to pinpoint, right? But in the recent history, near future, we're kind of in the middle of it, where we're now moving into a future missional strategy discussion in art and design. So within the design world, we may be moving from this long-standing approach, now considering the new sacred attractional model.